Welcome to the Theory Notes. We're back here again. I'm Chef Christian. Today we're talking SITHCCC041 Produce cakes, pastries, and breads. Probably one of my favourite subjects. So we start off talking about ingredients and I guess a little bit of terminology. We've got baking powder. Baking powder is a combination of ingredients that is used for chemical aeration. Yeah, it's a powder which, when moistened and heated, produces gas, causing items to rise. So you get these various other components within the cakes or whatever the baking powder is going into. Essentially, it's always a cake batter. Um, whether it's pancakes, cupcakes, gatos. Um, the baking powder is uh, often used. It's one of the ingredients in self-raising flour, and people often get bicarb and baking powder confused, because a lot of people call bicarb soda baking soda, and so you get that error where people think of baking powder and baking soda as the same thing. Glycerin's the next one. It's this liquid that is, as a shelf life extender, is glycerin. Icing sugar, or confectioner's sugar, icing powder, superfine sugar. Um, it's used for a number of reasons, just for dusting to finish some cakes or desserts. It's also used as it dissolves easier into products. So quite often we might use it in a meringue if we want to whip that up and get that done quickly. Like a French style meringue, or I guess used for a number of other reasons. Not to be confused with icing mixture, where icing mixture has cornstarch mixed in it, right? So that can be a challenge when you're using it. Also, you can taste the cornstarch in icing mixture. Icing sugar and all sugars are hygroscopic, which means they absorb moisture out of the air. So quite often you will find icing sugar has lumps in it, and that's just because it's absorbed the water out of the air. Okay. Icing mixture doesn't do that because the corn flour interrupts the bonding of that. So that's quite often why you can see a difference in the two. Essences. Essences are essentially sort of flavor. Um, there's an array of essences you can use, from mint, couple like spring to vine, vanilla essence, peppermint essence. You get lots of different flavors. They're aromatic liquids. Yeah. Pastry cream or creme patissier is a thickened custard. And it used to be that we would thicken this with plain flour, wheaten flour. More recently, with a lot of gluten intolerances or allergies, we moved on to corn starch, so made from corn. A lot of people still use corn flour, but corn flour is made from wheat. So what you're looking for is gluten-free corn flour, which is corn starch. So creme patissier is milk, sugar, vanilla essence, egg yolks. Um, like a lot of egg products, egg sauces, you could use whole eggs, but obviously egg yolk is going to give a richer flavor because the egg white is mostly water. Okay. Um, uh, yeah. Sometimes creme patissier has butter in it. A lot of times it doesn't. Depends what we're using it for. Okay, so if we're going to use it in a product that we're going to cook, we probably don't use a creme patissiere with butter in it. But if we're going to use one that we're going to pipe and set, or use for, yeah, a tart, for example, then butter's a great one because it sets a little bit firmer, it's a little bit richer. Okay, that last one there is ghee, which is clarified butter. Um, I guess the reason you might use ghee is just if you don't want any milk solids or water in your butter, right? Um, so clarifying it takes all of that out. You can buy ghee just on its own in a can, and you can take it and you can whip it back to a sort of consistency. But generally, it would be something that we would use to make maybe some sort of butter emulsion sauce, or for brushing on cake pans or tart rings to ensure that things don't stick to them. Okay. Yeah, so some terminology there. A little bit about ingredients coming up next. Flour, wheaten flour. We talk about different strengths of flour, fundamentally being about the amount of the wheat that gets crushed. Okay, so the outer parts of it that don't have the inner hard parts are really quite soft, and that gets used for all-purpose or plain flour. And so the more you go to the inner side of the inside of the wheat husk or the bran, the more protein uh, the higher the level of protein. Um, and so then, therefore, that's determined as being stronger flour, right? Because it has more protein, which, when bonded, the proteins create gluten. Okay. Um, an interesting point there is the level of protein is there's two different tests for level of protein which produce a different value. So sometimes you can find European measures and American measures are different, and so we have recipes from either one of those two that talks about flour of a different protein level, and you're like, oh, but I'm using that protein level. So yeah, that's a little bit of trivia there for you. Um, the in terms of cakes, pastries, and breads, the stronger the flour, the higher the gluten, the connection, the more easy the bread is to create free-form shapes. So the weaker the flour, the less gluten is in there, which is much better for sort of cakes when we want a softer texture. And indeed, cake flour is a product you can get. So we get different grades of flour, from cake flour, which is plain flour mixed with cornstarch, to all-purpose or plain flour, which is higher, sort of typically about 10% protein, to in Australia it gets called baker's flour, which can you rarely see this, but that's can be anything from 12% to 14%. And then in other parts of the world, you get what's called bread flour. Now, in Australia, we don't particularly get bread flour, but bread flour is what we would want for a free-form bread, a sourdough, or some Vienna loaves, or something that we might we want to have a free-form shape. If we're going to make bread in a tin, the sides of the tin support the bread to grow up, and so you don't particularly need higher protein content flour to when you're making bread in a tin. Yeah, there's lots of information there on flour, okay, and gluten. Eggs, and certainly egg wash. Now eggs come in different sizes. So typically for um, cakes, pastries, and breads, which recipes are quite scientific. We want um, measured quantities of eggs, egg yolk, egg white. It should be a measured um, in grams rather than quantities. One egg, two eggs is really, or two egg yolks is really not scientific enough for cakes, pastries, and breads. Okay, egg wash is something. Eggs have these amazing properties, from clarifying to binding to aerating. They're really amazing culinary product. Um, in terms of egg wash, we use them to brush on things, anything from shoe paste to the outside of breads. If you're using whole eggs and maybe milk, then you get a nice um, sort of sticky contact on the outside. Whereas if you want something darker, then we would just use we would just use egg yolks and maybe some sort of fat, a little bit of vegetable oil to extend it. So yeah, breakdown of eggs is the egg yolk is the fat, and the egg white is protein and mostly water. Like I'm not sure what it is, 80 to 90% water. Okay, so you think about that in the context of how you're going to use it, what preparation you're going to use it. Okay. Cool. Moving right along. Ganache. Ganache can be used as to line the outside of something. It could be used to coat the outside of something. It could be used internally in a chocolate tart. Um, it could be set in a tin and then mixed up and used for piping decorations. Um, yeah, it's a rich chocolate filling or glaze. Typically, there's a ratio of cream to chocolate. Maybe even glucose would be mixed in there, depending on how set we want the chocolate. A couple of different ratios there for different types of chocolate. Okay, cool. Next slide. Um, some classical breads, cakes and pastries. A Genoise sponge, which is the picture there, the big one down the bottom, is a Italian style, right? It's aerated by eggs and manual aeration. Yeah. A pound cake you've got there, classic type of cake. Um, the pound cake is known, and I'll talk about it later, but it's called a pound cake because these traditional recipes were very much, a pound of all four ingredients: pound of sugar, pound of butter, pound of flour, pound of eggs, and yeah. So other cakes are derivations of that. Eclairs, classic pastry. Macaron, classic pastry, sort of more a classic biscuit, but yeah, it comes under the pastry section. And then baguettes being classic breads, and pita bread being a classic bread as well. Okay. This one's more about contemporary breads, cakes, and pastries, right? So the difference of classical and contemporary, meaning classical is more sort of traditional style, contemporary is more modern adaptations or interpretations. So you get pull apart breads, you get chia and fruit loaf, which are breads. In terms of pastries, we're talking chocolate croissants or ham, cheese, and pineapple Danish square. In terms of pastries, sorry, yeah, so stacked raspberry millefeuille as well, and then cakes for arch cake, wall cake, yeah, some typically contemporary items there, or something else you might want to add. But the idea here is that it's more a modern ideal, right? Is what contemporary means. You can see those chocolate hot cross buns there. So traditionally at Easter, it was about bread mixed with dried fruits, right? And then the cross was piped on the top. Nowadays, you see hearts as the design on top, or Sonoma, I think, put an S for the name of their, for the Sonoma brand. Um, cool. A little bit about quality. I guess, quality is, and the characteristics of that are about the consistency of the item and the appearance, the taste, the texture, the color, and the balance, right? So, having a balance of those and a balance of tastes goes towards quality. Certainly, consistency and shape are also go towards the appearance. Yeah, good picture of macarons there. Madeira cake. Yeah, it's a pound cake, lemon sponge or butter cake in traditional British cookery. Comes from the classic pound cake. Mousse cake, yeah, uh, pretty basic idea. Couple of little difficult techniques, but once you master it, it's people love it. Very similar to a cheesecake. Fruit cakes, yeah, it's traditionally sort of Christmas idea, and you can see, often it's a ton of fruit, right? It's really heavy, really rich. A lot of dried mixed fruit, brandy, orange dried dates, brown sugar was, so that's really, really quite rich. Very much a Christmas cake. Genoise we talked about. Yeah, classic sponge relying on whipping air into the mix. Yeah. Um, I've had this theory about genoise, which is really quite interesting. The genoise cake, they take eggs and sugar and they warm it over a bain-marie to sort of start to dissolve the sugar, put it in a mixture and then whip it. Now, in terms of pastry, what we know about egg whites is that egg whites don't whip properly when there's fat, right? So this is why we always focus on our eggs being separated cleanly, and they can't have egg yolks in them because that's fat, right? And the fat interrupts the binding of the proteins to hold the meringue. So surely when you think about a cake like a sponge, separating the egg whites and whipping the egg whites and then whipping the egg yolks separately and then folding them together would produce a bigger, better rise. And it does, and that's called a chiffon cake. Um, Muffins, cute little muffins there. Muffins are probably one of the easiest cakes to make. It's a chemical aeration. And you can see there it is. It says here they're made from eggs for richness, a little bit of rise, and baking powder. Swiss roll, pretty cool. It's a softened, thin layer sponge, um, typically filled with cream and jam. This one's just filled with jam, but yeah, it's yeah, go the Swiss, yeah. Cold set cake, yeah, it's pretty cool. Typically, is a cheesecake. Um, yeah, so it's a product that you would use and probably set with gelatin, so it needs to go into the fridge and then it firms up while it's in the fridge from the fat that's in it. In saying that, I've got this awesome chocolate torte, which is made from, which is very similar to a brulee, sort of, but it's basically eggs, sugar, some flour, butter, and chocolate, and you just whip all the ingredients apart from the flour, fold a little bit of flour in, and then you cook it really slowly until the eggs come to pasteurization point, and then you take it and chill it and set it, and it's this awesome. In fact, it doesn't have flour in it because it's flourless. Um, yeah, it's so that's a cold set cake, and you're basically setting the fats. Okay, friands and financiers, little tea fancies. Okay, petit fours typically. Little small almond cakes made with yeah, almond flour. The friand is the one on the left with the fruits on top, and the financier is the one on the right. So the financiers, are made that way because they're supposed to resemble gold bullion bars. A little bit still more about cakes here. You've got some historical examples and some cultural examples. Um, yeah, so a bit of history. Madeira butter and plain cakes were all derived from the classic pound cake. Okay, that's what I was talking about before. So yeah, I think I've got something a little bit later about pound cake. Um, yeah, a cultural example might be sort of the Lamington, right? So the sponge was adapted in Australia to become the Lamington, and that's the picture of a Lamington there, where you get this sponge that's got this jam center, rolled in chocolate and then rolled in coconut. So a classic sort of Australian, New Zealand cake. Moving on a bit more about breads now. So when we talk about the concept of fermentation, and you can see that picture there is pretty cool. So essentially, we talk about bread being, and the real basics of bread are flour, water, salt, and yeast. Okay. Now, the yeast needs the right conditions for it to work properly. It needs food, and it needs moisture, and it needs warmth. Okay, so if you give it the right amount of those products in the right quantities, you get, it works its magic. So the yeast will feed on carbohydrates, and that could be in the form of flour. So slow fermentation is where the enzymes convert the starches, and it feeds the yeast, and then as a byproduct, it creates carbon dioxide, and um, uh, yeah, and so then what happens is if you develop your dough properly and work the gluten, or combine the proteins to create the gluten, then the gluten will trap the CO2 that is created, and that's how we get this expanding bread. Is by the gluten bubbles trapping the carbon dioxide that's produced from the yeast eating the sugars or the starches. Um, yeah, in the mixture. You could, certainly in bread, you could add sugar, you could add honey, any of the inverted sugars, and that will produce a faster product, which is, what a lot of commercial breads are just really quick made bread. However, our stomachs can't um, um, uh, break that bread down properly, right? That's why they talk about sourdough being a much better product for your stomach, because there's a longer fermentation, and so enzymes have had a lot of time to work and eat through a lot of the components in that bread, so it's just better for your digestion. Yeah, so you can see that's a picture of a gluten window. We call it the window pane test, where you stretch out a thin piece of dough to see how stretchy it can be. In terms of dough development, we are what we're looking at there is if we simply add water to flour, that's going to hydrate the flour. It's going to activate the gluten. Okay, kneading it or stretching it with your hands is going to make it more smooth and more stretchy. Then you get these other sort of techniques that are stretching and folding, and that gives it a chewy, light, and airy texture. Um, Whereas resting the dough sort of relax the gluten, and you get these long protein chains. Yeah, it's pretty cool actually. Um, The rest of these are sort of yeah. Well, all of these ones now about bread are sort of why do we add or why do we do these processes, right? So adding fats will to cakes, pastries, and breads gives flavour, gives moisture, gives richness, and can support aeration, but it can also interrupt aeration. right? So depending on how much and what we're using it in can affect, certainly fats will affect gluten. Um, yeah, so depending on whether it's a cake, whether it's a pastry, or whether it's a bread, will determine, sort of why that fat is in there. Um, Work surfaces. So um, the work surfaces is a why do we chill it? Sorry, I lost my spot there for a second. But chilling of ingredients and work surfaces, there's two main reasons why we do that. Um, Depending on what sort of product we're making, we really want to keep that product as cold as possible. Yeah, the idea of putting a product into the fridge would be to set the butter. So depending on how long we leave it in there, that's going to stay firm. Um, and depending on what the product is, maybe yeah, the water absorbs less into the protein in the flour when the temperatures are lower, right? So that's going to slow down gluten activation. But also, the cold butter might provide a better air pocket for aeration purposes. Yeah, so it depends on again what it is as to why we're chilling the product down. They talk about pastries mostly being the um, um, when we want to use a cold work surface. Maybe it's a marble bench to get away from the metal benches. Yeah, the metal benches sort of when products come into contact with a metal bench, generally they will melt faster. Yeah, because the metal holds onto the heat more than a marble, for example. So, yeah, moving on. Cutting, shaping, and molding. We've got sort of cutting as the top picture there, where we're using our pastry scraper. Maybe we're separating the product into the required number of pieces, and that looks like it's possibly bread or pastry. Shaping, that's a machine shaper, creates the rounded shape that we want. And Molding is just about creating the required form. Yeah, so cutting is separating the product, shaping is to produce items of the required size, weights, or shapes, and molding would be to create the required form. Yeah, so yeah, there's a pretty interesting technique behind it, the balling process, and essentially it's about stretching the outside of the dough to make a smooth outside. Kneading. Yeah, so we talk about this term that bakers do. They knead the dough. Right? It's a classic old joke, but it's about combining the ingredients evenly, developing the gluten, and making the ingredients smooth and soft, which is all about the final product. Cool. Activities involved in preparing fillings. Um, so we're talking about activities in the preparation and um, um, using of fillings for cakes, pastries, and breads. So thawing, so that's some food safety considerations there. Essentially, it's about maybe taking it out of the freezer and leaving it in the fridge to defrost. Maybe it's taking it out of the fridge and leaving it in the kitchen environment to soften a little bit, so it's easy to work with. Mincing is, actually, there was someone that said that when I move around the kitchen, I mince around the kitchen. Not really sure what that means, but I think what we're talking about here is mincing, which is sort of putting things through a mincer, sort of like meat mince, right? So chopping, I guess, would be similar to mincing, chopping into smaller pieces. Peeling. Probably means trimming the outside of fruits is what I think of when we're talking about peeling. Maybe trimming, maybe just peeling. So like mandarins, for example, we would probably just peel with our hands rather than trim with a knife. Slicing, yeah. So again, using our knives, dicing, using our knives, and cooking. So several different activities that refer to preparation and ingredients. Um, so yeah, some of these slides, it looks like we're jumping around all over the place, but I have tried to keep them consistent with the way the questions are asked, and they sort of go all over the place. But anyway, resting is what we do to bread and pastries. It generally, if we are generally with doughs, we talk about plastic and elastic doughs. Okay, so elastic dough is when we knead it a lot. It's a bread dough. We knead it to get the gluten activated and to form those chains that are going to create those bubbles. So that would be our elastic dough. With pastry, we don't really want to activate the gluten because we don't want the pastry moving when we cook it, right? So um, we then talk about more a lot more resting time with pastry, right? To relax the gluten. So if we take our pastry and we squeeze it a lot or manipulate it a lot, then it will shrink as we cook it, and we don't particularly want that. So we would rest it to allow the gluten to relax. Okay, rolling, pretty straightforward. It's about getting the required thickness. A couple of different types of pastry here. There's quite a few pastries to learn about. Typically, we talk about pastry or paste, with paste being the raw product and pastry being the cooked product. Okay. Short crust is more of a savory concept. Okay. You can get a sweet short paste. Yeah, so talks about a pastry with a biscuit-like crumbly texture that resists moisture, making it ideal for tarts and quiches. Okay, short crust. Pâte brisée is what we're talking about there. Maybe pâte à fonce, which are the two French terms, one sort of richer than the other. Sweet pastry, we get two types of sweet pastry. We get sugar paste, or we get what's called biscuit paste. So sweet paste, pâte sucrée, or biscuit paste, which is pâte sablé, right? And so yeah, sort of richer and sweeter is the sablé one. It's got more butter in it, essentially. Choux paste, yeah. Choux means cauliflower in French, and these sort of little choux buns are supposed to resemble a cauliflower. Choux paste gets used for a number of products. You've got little choux buns there, okay, and they're not profiteroles because they don't have the chocolate on top. These ones in the middle, they're choux swans. And then over on the left-hand side there, you've got eclairs in the center, and then something else. Yeah, there's a number of products that gets used with paste, from religieuse to Paris-Brest to Gâteau Saint-Honoré. Eclairs, obviously, you can use choux paste to make one of the types of gnocchi, or gougères is another one. So it's sort of gougères are a savoury cheese flavoured choux bun. Yeah, so choux paste is pretty cool. A little bit different to most other pastes in that it in the first process it's cooked. So the dough is cooked, and then eggs are added into it when it's cold to produce this pipeable mixture. Yeah. Next up is strudel pastry or paste, which is similar to phyllo, really uh, thin. Um, so you sort of activate the gluten and then let it rest for a long time, and then you're able to really stretch it out really, really thin. Um, it says here it's similar to puff pastry, with the idea being there that if you make it thin, spread it with butter, and do another layer, then another layer of butter, then another layer, then another layer of butter. That's essentially what puff pastry is really thin sheets of pastry with butter in between them. Okay. Um, yeah, so yeah, strudel was a German concept. Phyllo is, I think, the Greek idea of it. Pretty pretty similar process, although really with a strudel pastry we stretch it out by hand, whereas a phyllo is we use a rolling pin. Just on that last one, the Turkish people do a version of the phyllo pastry called gözleme, and you probably know the term gözleme, as the Turkish gözleme women are at every festival. Um, On to laminated doughs, right? And we're talking about pâte feuilletée here, which is puff pastry. You can see the picture on the right is the raw paste, and the picture on the left is the pastry. The one on the right, you can see there's a number of layers of dough and then butter in between them. So challenging paste to make, although not as challenging as the next one. Puff paste is typically what gets used for pies, sausage rolls, and turnovers, maybe millefeuilles. I was actually in the kitchen today making choux paste and finishing puff paste and making a gâteau sonore. So puff pastry base, and then we used creme pâte beurre in the middle, and filled the profiteroles with that, and then the caramel top and gâteau sonore cream. Yeah, it's sort of a mixture of those two pastes. Two more here that are laminated doughs are the croissant and Danish, both laminated. The croissant is of a typical shape. You get a crescent shape or the straight shape. Technically, they say that the straight shape is made with butter, whereas the curved shape is made with margarine, or maybe it's the other way around. Other people say that, well, pastry chefs make the straight ones, whereas bakers make the curved ones. But traditionally, it was the curved shape, and it was supposed to resemble the moon on the Turkish flag as an offering to the Turks that had helped during the war. Danish pastry, again, a laminated dough. Danish pastry is a little different to croissant dough, as the Danish pastry is a little bit richer as it has eggs in it. Yeah, so a little bit of a different dough or détrempe, but still has the lamination with the butter or the beurrage, which is the butter sheet. Baguettes, the typical shape. Yeah. In France, they have this competition for baguettes. We have bread competitions here, but they have quite strict rules about baguettes, about the shape, the scoring, the fermentation, the length, number of points of consideration. We've got a bath bun here, and the bath bun is what exactly is a bath bun? A bath bun is a sweet roll made from milk, and it has that sugar sprinkled on top. It's an enriched yeast dough. So fruit buns are um, a bath bun variation, right? So yeah, culturally adapted into the hot cross bun. Yeah, a number of different types here. You get the French rolls, a soft white milk roll. Okay, so when we use milk inside a bread or a pastry, it gives changes the color of the outcome, but also it's a little bit of fat, so that goes back to what we were talking about richness before and flavor. Unleavened breads are flat breads, typically without a raising agent, so no yeast. And that's, unleavened bread has been adapted to become wraps. Okay, so alter adaptation from flat breads or unleavened breads into wraps. Okay, Cool. Pasties, or pastries, yeah, but you can see here that's a picture of a pasty. So the pasty was, a baked item that arose from the need for miners to have a convenient and easy to eat meal while underground. Rise to the pastry. There's some cultural examples of pastries here. You've got the Americans adding cream, cheese, and fruit accepted to their Danish pastries to create what's now known as Danish pastries. Okay, so a lot of these different sort of cultural adaptations. And then the eclair, the cultural origin, was where it was, originally it was called the Petite Duchesse or the Pain à la Duchesse, the Duchess's pastry, or the little Duchess. Yeah. So lots of adaptation around, and sort of concepts coming from contemporary, or oh, sorry, from culturally um, adaptation of classical items into contemporary items. A couple of little points on breads as well. You get these adaptations. The flat breads adapting to become wraps. The fruit buns adapting to become hot cross buns to mark Easter. Okay, so we are back here at, this is knowledge test 2 and down at question 11, right? So selecting and preparing appropriate equipment. Why do we do that? Maybe we're talking about using the right product or the right tool for safety. Maybe we're talking about getting the expected or desired outcome or of the final product. Maybe it's about ensuring the volume of the mix can be accommodated in the cooking process. Maybe it's to facilitate the proper cooking of the item, right? Or to ensure the finished product can be easily removed when it's cooked. And here we might be talking about, using a springform pan. And so springform pans for cakes is a certain item where the outside gets locked in and then you can undo it at the end so it's easy to get out. Maybe we're talking about tart cases that have a base that you can push up from the bottom so it's easy enough to get that out of the tart pan. Maybe it's a loaf pan, so it's, so we get a loaf shape and a nice straight sides rather than a free-form shape. So, typically certain items are cooked in a certain container for a specific reason. Plating considerations, right, to support service and consumption. Maybe we're talking about some, why are we going to use the certain item? Just looking at that picture, it's a really interesting plate. It's a square plate with sort of wavy lines. Plates, they say plates add an element of class and certainly raise the prices of the dishes that you are serving. Maybe it's to match the style and the size. It might be using cold plates for cold items and hot plates for hot items. Maybe it's just about ensuring that the portion side of the food looks correct on the plate that you've got. Certainly what we should be aiming for is for consistency, so that items, when they're served, are on the same plate every time. Okay, squeezy bottles are used for sauces and decoration and garnish. Here we are back to sort of methods and stirring and aerating. Why do we do that? Stirring and aerating is all about combining the product for consistency. It's also about increasing the volume of the product once it's cooked, okay, which is what aerating is about. Okay, a little bit of information there about batters, right? Why we take things to certain consistencies. Measurements. So scaling and measurements are, important factors when working with cakes, pastries, and breads. It really is scientific, and if you want the same outcome every time, which consistency is the key, until you're a master pastry chef or baker, you should not be changing measurements, right? So the reason we measure things for those reasons there, to obtain a final product that meets expectations, for consistency, to avoid wastage, and to control food costs. Right, pretty basic stuff. Sieving. Why do we sieve products? Sieving realistically is about ensuring that there's no lumps. Remember before we talked about icing sugar and that the icing sugar absorbs moisture. It can create lumps quite often with icing sugar. More often than not, you need to sieve icing sugar. Same with cocoa. Cocoa absorbs the moisture and you end up with lumps. It may even be that there's something in the flour. I found rocks in flour before. I found bugs like weevils. It really is a good idea to sieve. It can. A lot of people believe that it makes it easier to fold the product, to fold the flour and the dry ingredients in when you sieve it. Ultimately, it doesn't particularly make it lighter, but it does disperse the flour more and ensure it's not clumped, which means that it can be then easier to fold in. So sieving is definitely a good idea. Whisking is about combining and aerating. Yeah, so it might be just stirring with a whisk. Maybe it's about beating, which is about aeration. Folding is a concept that we talk about for ensuring that we don't knock the air out of eggs, essentially. It's just gently combining by stirring gently from around the outside and then folding it over into the center. So gentle combination of ingredients. Piping, yeah, it's all about shapes and presentation, typically in a piping bag. Spreading is where we are using our palette knife, yeah, which we talked about in one of the other in one of the other units of competency, and we talked about using the palette knife. And you can see there it might be just about evenly dispersing our cream or frosting or ganache. Okay, refers to adding an even layer of filling or frosting to make a cake or item using a method other than a piping bag. Cool. Knowledge test 2 should now be finished and we should be moving through knowledge test 3. So yeah, bit of information here about fillings, right? And we talk about the fillings, pastry fillings, savory animal proteins. So you've got to be quite careful with animal proteins, okay? Because a lot of them can be high risk, potentially hazardous. It can include meat, chicken, game, offal, fish, eggs, okay? So typically the mixture must be cooked before adding into pastry cases. Probably not eggs, but certainly those other items. Some things, smoked salmon, you don't need to cook it before you use it, but in a quiche, for example. But some would say that it's already cooked because of the process that's done where it's salted and then smoked. So all the moisture's out, therefore minimal bacteria can affect that. Cool. Pastry fillings, savory, dairy. Yeah, again, high risk, potentially hazardous fillings. This could be cream, butter, milk, or cheese. Probably not meat, but yeah, it adds flavour and texture. Pastry filling, savoury vegetables. Yeah. So 3 main categories of savoury fillings there, right? They need to be pre-cooked before use. They add visual appeal. They add different textures. They contribute nutritional value. Yeah, fundamentally about fibre. Cool. So pastry fillings we're talking about here. Sweet cream. Yeah. So this is a list of the main categories. Yeah, so cream, coming up to custard, then fruit. Okay, Typically for the main categories of sweet filling for pastries, we're talking about cheese, chocolate cream, custard, fruit, and nuts. Okay. Um, yeah, and so they're used to fill or decorate. They're available in various types with different fat content. They can be flavored and colored. Um, if we're talking about custard, it can be produced in a range of thicknesses. It's a dairy product, right? So we need to consider food hygiene there. Comes in various different fat contents, and it's used to fill cakes, pastries, and sponges, cakes, sponges, and pastries. Cakes for filling sweet fruit, right? Generally, it's about being seasonal. Maybe they're cooked or poached. Um, they're used as filling as decorations. Lovely raspberry tart there in the background. Okay. Cake fillings we are moving on to, right? So again, jumping a little bit around the place, but um, typically we talk about yeah these categories of um, fillings for cakes um, and um, cream, custard, fresh fruit, jams, mousse, nuts would be the six main types of fillings for cakes. When we talk about chocolate, right, and we're moving on now to um, question 12. Where chocolate comes in white, milk, or dark. Typically, are the three main types that we see. Ruby's a new one that's come along. You can get um, chocolate in as a block. You can get it in as Calais. You can get it in powder form. You can get it in essence form. Okay. If it's couverture, it needs to be tempered before being used. Melts at 30 to 32 degrees. It's used as an ingredient, coating, and as a decoration. Okay, and it's one of 7 main types of decorations for cakes and sponges. Okay, moving on to fruits, right? And we might be talking about question 8 here. Um, so culinary characteristics and uses of fruit. They're seasonal, right? Um, yeah, they're available in a range of form, fresh, crystallized, or preserved. They can be processed, right? So they could be turned into coulis, they could be turned into jams, toppings, or purees. Okay, maybe they might need to be trimmed or peeled. Maybe they're added fresh. They're certainly used as fillings and decorations. Okay. Um, Yeah, they are one of 7 main types of decorations for cakes, sponges, and pastries. So that goes towards, um, yeah, a couple of questions there. Question 5, question 4. Have a look through. Next one's about glazes. Right. So glazes are, you can see by the picture there, glazes get used in a number of different ways. There's typically when we make a Madeira cake, we might put a glaze over the top of it, similar to these donuts that are in the picture. It's just an icing glaze. So it's literally just icing sugar mixed up with a bit of whatever liquid, maybe lemon juice, orange juice, water, maybe. Um, they provide a glossy finish or add color to finished products. They can be neutral or flavored. Um, they can add some taste variety to a finished product. They can be used to keep toppings such as nuts in place. They're one of 7 main decorations for cakes, sponges, and pastries. Okay, um, they could be used as decorations, or they could be, um, yeah, generally they set pretty quickly when they come into contact with an air, and so you really need to use them pretty quickly before they set. Okay, Next up is jellies. Um, yeah, a couple of different jellies there. It looks like you've got a mango passion fruit jelly. Maybe they're cut out and put into drinks. Maybe they're turned into pâte de fruits, just like the picture up the top there. They could be used to form a top or a middle layer. Maybe they're there for color. Maybe they're there for texture. Maybe they're there for taste. Yeah, they are the one of seven main types of decorations for cakes, sponges, and pastries. Icings is up next. Um, yeah, the icing on the cake. Um, so similar to glaze, although this, icings are more of a firmer topping. They might be used to coat or cover the item. They're pretty sweet generally. They could be poured, piped, or spread. They could be used to create a pattern or a design. Sometimes fondant goes over the top of them. Yeah, they're used as fillings. They're also used as decorations. Okay, icings. Cool. Awesome picture there. You can see what's in the picture there. I think I've got little freons, right? Sprinkling icing sugar over the top. Yeah, in the background you can see raspberry freon. So icing sugar is generally sprinkled on, finely ground white sugar, can be made into a pattern, used to create frostings. Yeah, one of seven main types of decorations. Nuts is up next. Um, that's quite funny. Nuts is another item that can be used for fillings or decorations. Across cakes, sponges, and pastries. Yeah, they could be sprinkled on, they could be sliced or shaved, they could be toasted or roasted. If you get hard or soft ones, there does need to be consideration for special diets when we talk about nuts. A lot of people are allergic to tree nuts. Meringues is the next one. Again, we're talking about eggs, right? Culinary properties and characteristics of eggs are just incredible. Yeah, meringues are one of seven main types of decorations for pastries, um, or even desserts, right? Maybe an il flottante, floating islands. Maybe it's a pomalaska. That's meringue on the outside. Generally, there's three types of meringue: French style, or sorry, styles: French style, Swiss style, and Italian. And they are all made differently. The French is a raw product and is used for um, a specific method for the desserts generally. And you get the Swiss and the Italian, which are both sort of made. The Swiss is where you mix it up, warm it up over a bain marie first, and then you get the Italian, which is where we add hot sugar syrup onto our egg whites. So those other two are certainly cooked already, and so they're used for specific um, recipes as well. Okay. Bit of information on bake time. Okay, you can see there you've got times and temperatures: fruitcake, genoise, meringue, cream puff, sausage rolls, strudel, japonaise. Um, So yeah, all these different cookery products have different times and temperatures for different reasons. So just moving on, a few more points here about um, I guess the operations within a kitchen. Mise en place we all know about is um, everything is in its place essentially. Right. We know what that means. We need gathering all the equipment, gathering all our ingredients, and filling out workflow and time flow. Stock rotation, important aspects. FIFO is typically what we use, first in, first out, and all the information there about stock rotation, description of food items, date and time produced, etc. When we talk about environmental conditions, we are focusing, on how products are stored, essentially. protecting from external damage, storing under the right temperatures, whether they're wrapped or not, airtight containers. Yeah, cleanliness and hygiene is, I guess, what we're looking at. Last couple of ones here on quality indicators. What do we look for? We look for use by, best before dates. We look for packaging and wrapping that's intact and no sign of pest infestation. And the last one's about WHS. We should be checking and inspecting items and equipment prior to use, always following the manufacturer's instructions, and certainly wearing our PPE and specific clothing when working in these commercial environments. That's my notes for this subject. I hope that's been information that is helpful for what you're undertaking. Looking forward to see you. This has been Chef Christian. Looking forward to seeing you in the next coming slides. Thank you.